I got to tell you to hold that thought for a second, Butch. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Member of Congress representing Eastern Washington, Cathy McMorris Rodgers. Congresswoman, it's good to have you on the program.
Good afternoon. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you on. Let's talk about Obamacare and whether or not it's going to be replaced with something good and conservative, or is this the program we're stuck with, the one put forward by House Speaker Paul Ryan?
We are on a mission to rescue Americans from this failed law. And Obamacare, although it was well-intentioned, the goal was to bring down premiums. It was to provide more options. It has failed, and it's only getting worse. I think as far as the path forward, I supported the bill that came out of Energy and Commerce last week. And I think it's important for you and listeners to recognize this is step one in a process to get us to a better place. So step one, phase one, is what we passed out of committee last week. The base of that bill is the repeal bill that we put on the president's desk last year that passed the House and the Senate and that President Obama vetoed. What we are doing is adding to that bill transition provisions that will make for a smoother transition. So the base bill is the repeal of Obamacare, and then that we put on the president's desk last year, and then we add to that the expansion of health savings accounts, the Medicaid reforms, getting back Medicaid to the states, more flexibility at the state level, allowing states to structure that program in a way that we believe will actually improve outcomes and reduce costs. It's the tax credit for individuals to go into the marketplace and purchase health insurance, and that this is phase one. And then phase two is at Health and Human Services, lifting the regulatory burden on the health insurance market. When you look at Obamacare, there were over 1,400 times that Health and Human Services was directed to write, fill in the blank, to write the policy. And we now have Tom Price as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And then phase three is going to be those policy provisions that are going to require 60 votes in the Senate. We're very anxious to pass the policy to allow for the purchase across state lines, the association health plans. And we're going to get working on that right away.
Congresswoman, why can't we have that in phase one? Because I distrust the willingness of Congress to actually get to phases 2 and 3. There are too many times that the Congress has said, this is the first step, we'll get to 2 and 3 later, and then we never get to 2 and 3.
Right. Well, that's a great question. The ability to get phase one on the president's desk is based upon a budget tool called reconciliation, and that allows us to get it through the Senate with 50 votes. We are limited in budget reconciliation to only those policy provisions that actually have a budget impact. And so when you look at something like a policy idea to allow for the purchase of health insurance across state lines, it doesn't have a budget impact. So that's where we're loading up phase one. Yes,
Congress,
everything that we can. So we repeal the Obamacare taxes, we repeal the Obamacare mandate, and then we move into the tax credits, the Medicaid reform, the expansion of health savings accounts, because those are all budget impact items, and that is the limitation of reconciliation.
Well, let me ask you this, though. You say we're repealing it, but the way I read it and the way I've read the commentary around it, we're not really repealing Obamacare. We're kind of making changes to the current Obamacare law without actually repealing the entire law that sits under it. And the explanation is, well, we have to do this through reconciliation. Congresswoman, let me ask it to you this way. You would only go nuclear in the Senate to a simple majority vote, which the Senate could do if the circumstances were dire enough. I'd make the argument that they're dire enough. 1/6 of our economy is health care. The current system is dying around us as we speak. If that isn't dire enough to merit a nuclear option in the Senate, what is?
Well, that is a decision for the Senate, as you know, Lars. And for years now, I have been frustrated with the number of bills that we would pass out of the House that I felt were very important, and then they go over to the Senate and they would die. Leading up until this election in 2016, I believed that we were at a constitutional crisis, that when you saw what the previous administration was doing through rules and regulations, through executive orders, and the House would take action and then we couldn't get something through the Senate, I believed that the Senate needed to look at changing those rules. The Senate, to date, has not been willing to change the rules, the procedures in the Senate, and so that is where we, last year, when we put the repeal bill on the president's desk, we did it through this tool. Once a year, we have an opportunity through the budget process to pass a reconciliation bill, and that's the tool that we're using because we believe that that is the most likely bill to get on the president's desk. And we want to get this done. And we want to get it done as soon as possible this year. And so as I said, it's the foundation of the bill that we are working on right now is the repeal bill that we passed last House and Senate and was vetoed by President Obama. And it repeals the Obamacare taxes. It repeals the mandate.
But Congresswoman, because we got you a little late.
Mandate, it repeals the taxes and it repeals the mandate.
We're a little, I don't know if you can hold through the break or not, but we're going to come up to a hard break. But here's my question. Number one, you don't repeal Medicaid expansion. And correct me if I'm wrong, that's the single most expensive part of Obamacare. But that's not being repealed. Why?
We repeal that as of 2020.
Why not now? It's killing us. I mean, it's very expensive, and the expansion includes a lot of healthy, young, able-bodied adults who are now on welfare medical care at the expense of the American taxpayer. Why not repeal it now?
True. What we're doing is we're unwinding it between now and that Medicaid expansion between now and 2020. You're absolutely right that the large majority, over 50% nationally, 80% in Washington state, of the Medicaid expansion are able-bodied adults. And what we're doing is providing a transition for them through other means, setting up a marketplace where their only option will not be Medicaid. For many of these individuals if we took action right now, there are not plans available to them in the marketplace.
Congresswoman, hold that thought for a moment. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Well, member of Congress Cathy McMorris Rodgers from Eastern Washington is nice enough to stay through with us. Madam, it's wonderful to have a few more minutes with you. But this business of not actually repealing Obamacare, I know that Speaker Ryan has said we're repealing it, but they leave so many of the disastrous pieces in place. For example, all the insurance regs that drove up the cost of health care to begin with. Is there any expectation that this thing is actually going to cut the cost of health care that has ballooned up so fast?
Absolutely. Actually, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, just came out with this analysis, and there's a lot of huge conservative victories, lowering premiums, increasing choices, reducing the deficit, lowering taxes, entitlement reform. When can you ever remember Congress doing this type of entitlement reform? I think you have to go back to the mid-'90s when we did welfare reform and got it back to the states, allowed the states to structure those programs in a way that got people living more independently. And we did it at lower cost with better outcomes. There's a lot of wins in this. I think it's important for conservatives to remember that when this law was passed, when the Affordable Care Act was passed back in 2009, on Christmas Eve, they had 60 votes in the Senate to pass this law.
Yep.
It passed the House in July, and it passed the Senate on Christmas Eve. And you remember they did the Louisiana purchase for Senator Landrieu, and they did the corn husker kickback, right, for Nebraska. And they cobbled it together, but they did have 60 votes. We are attempting to undo this law now. And clearly, we don't have 60 votes in the Senate to repeal it just with one big vote. So we're taking it step by step. And the first phase is what we're doing through reconciliation, which is, as I mentioned, it's a budget tool, but the base that we're using, because we used budget reconciliation last year to put the repeal of Obamacare on the president's desk, and President Obama vetoed that. But the base bill is budget reconciliation, and then we're adding as much to that as we can that we believe will help increase, the number of healthy choices in the marketplace and help stabilize this market, and that's the expansion of the health savings account.
But Congresswoman, look, we go back to the 60 votes, and you brought up the Senate again. Isn't this a situation that is dire enough for Americans, both on the job side and the premium side, to merit going the nuclear option in the Senate and doing it on 51 votes and doing everything that was promised? Because here's what my concern is, Congresswoman. You know Capitol Hill a whole lot better than I do because you serve back there. But when I look at it from a distance, when real conservatives out there who voted for Donald Trump and said, we want the things Trump's talking about, sales across state lines, we want to get our choices back, we want to get premiums down, we want real competition, when they say, well, they just delivered something that falls short of that, if you think you're short in the Senate today, where could we be in the fall of next year if a lot of Americans look at that result and say, yep, once again, they have not delivered what they said they were going to deliver? They're not going to give you the additional votes at that point. I know there are a lot of Democrats in the Senate who are up for re-election next fall, and it's a great opportunity as long as the Americans who put Trump in office, like me, because I was an advocate for him, and I endorsed him early on, but as long as we look at it and say they're actually delivering on the things they promised. If they perceive that you have not, because you gave them 1/3 of a loaf and promised the other 2/3 later, they're going to say, to heck with you guys, and you may lose some seats in the Senate. So why not do the whole thing now and go nuclear? And you tell me, is this not enough justification? The entire health insurance system of the country falling apart before our eyes. Is that enough justification to use the nuclear option on the Senate vote and get it on 51?
Well, that's ultimately a decision that the Senate has to make. I know that Senator McConnell had pulled a group of members together to look at the rules of the Senate. These are huge institutional questions that they have to make. To date, the Senate has not been willing to make the changes necessary that would allow for a 50 vote. Obviously, they have a lot to accomplish. They got to get a lot done in the Senate. They have a judge that they need to confirm. There's going to be some big decisions before the Senate, and we'll continue to see how this plays out. But at this point, that is not an option, and we believe that we have to be moving quickly. So the first step is to do this through budget reconciliation that only takes 50 votes in the Senate.
Well, the other thing, we talked about Medicaid expansion a moment ago, but one other thing about that. Over the next 3 years, this thing does not, the repeal or, the Ryan Care or whatever you want to call it, Rhino Care, there have been a number of derogatory names attached to it, doesn't discourage any of the states from continuing to sign people up for Medicaid, does it? So we could end up with a huge number of people 3 years from now who have been dependent on Medicaid for a good number of years, and they perceive it as something you're going to take away from them. Right?
There are some money that would be not made available to those states if they just expand. So there are some protections in place, and there's also within the bill there's a requirement that the states have to verify everyone that is on the Medicaid program. That's every 6 months. They have to go through and re-verify that these people that are on Medicaid actually meet the criteria to be on Medicaid. I keep thinking of this in terms of what we did in welfare in the mid-'90s. And it was really giving back to the states the ability to best structure these programs, best structure Medicaid. It is a very important safety net. It serves some of our most vulnerable and people with disabilities and pregnant women and children, low income. And we need to make sure that safety net is available, but that the states can structure it in a way that's actually going to result in better outcomes and lower costs.
Let me take it to your neighborhood then, Congresswoman. You're in Washington State. Do you trust the administration of Jay Inslee to do a sensible job of restructuring this medical mess?
Well, I always believe that the best decisions are going to be made closest to the people.
I do as well, but I'm asking you, Jay Inslee's the governor. Is he going to do a good job with this, or is he going to do what Democrats like to do, which is get as many people dependent on the government as possible?
Well, that's a debate that they would have to have in Washington State, and this is where you see the laboratories of democracy at work.
Well,
right?
I love that in
see
theory.
The competition of ideas.
But for instance,
like Indiana, that have actually converted most of their Medicaid now into, they're encouraging the health savings accounts. And as you see more states move in that kind of a direction, then legislators in Washington State and hopefully people in the future that hold these positions can make the case and say, you know what, there are states that are doing this better, that are getting better outcomes at a low cost, and we should be moving in that direction. I think that we need to see that among the states rather than the current approach where a year ago, Governor Inslee and Washington State had to ask for a waiver from the federal government. So they have to say, can we please make these changes to our program? And the federal government has to give the okay. That's backwards. It should be the states that decide and they're closest to the people, most accountable to the people, and they're going to make the best decisions. And even when it's Governor Inslee in that role, I still believe that I want Washington State to be in that position to make those decisions.
Well, one example, the state to the south of Washington State, Oregon, has a governor who is facing a budget deficit, she claims, of $1.8 billion. And she says 2/3 of that is because of the Medicaid expansion, which the state now has to start picking up. And her responsible move is not to say we have to live within our means, but to turn to the voters and the taxpayers and say, I need another $1 billion.
Well, at the state level, they do have the protection of having to balance their budgets, right? And at the end of the day, either they have to figure out how they can balance their budgets by reducing spending or, yes, raising taxes and going to the people to ask that permission. But right now, the federal government, we don't have a balanced budget amendment. We don't have a balanced budget requirement. And I just think that the federal government, we are going to be better served as citizens as we return more of these programs, more of these decisions back to the local level, back at the state level. And yes, you have to make tough decisions, but it's better. It's going to be smarter, and we're going to get better outcomes if it's done at the state level.
Congresswoman, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much for the time today and the extra time today.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Good to have you on. Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers, who represents Eastern Washington. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to the Lars Larson